Okay, so participants should now see the note that this meeting is being live streamed. So if you do mind having your camera on, please turn it off now because there will be a recording made of this workshop. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first workshop now. My name is Lenka Knapova. I am a part of the Open Digital Health Engagement team. And our today's workshop will be led by Rosie Esri. Rosie is a health psychologist and senior research fellow at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. Her research to date has focused on applying the person-based approach, which is something she will be talking about today. And it is an approach to developing and evaluating digital behavior change interventions for a range of health conditions, including chronic dizziness, protecting cognitive health in older adults, and most recently, supporting teenagers and young adults with the treatment and management of acne. So Rosie, I hand it over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining and for your interest in the person-based approach to intervention development and specifically digital intervention development. So today I'm going to introduce some of the key elements of the person-based approach and specifically how this has been and can be applied to the development of digital health and behaviour change interventions. It is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We normally run this workshop in about as a half-day workshop, so I'm going to try and kind of give you a bit of a taste of everything that we try and cover. So hopefully you can all hear me okay. Feel free to use the chat box to put questions in, and I'll try to get to those at the end. But I'm happy to answer questions afterwards if I'm not able to get to any of them. There will be some kind of points for discussion and breakout group activities as we go through. So to get started, I want to give you a general sense of what the person-based approach is. So it's a collection of research tools and techniques which together aim to facilitate a really, really in-depth understanding and appreciation of the needs and the preferences and the context in which your intended users of your intervention are living, so as to really be able to maximise the relevance of the intervention content that you develop and how persuasive and interesting it is to those people. And by doing this, in turn, it's likely to be able to improve engagement with your intervention, adherence to the advice that it's giving. And so ultimately, this should lead to greater target behaviour change and so hopefully better health outcomes. And the way the person-based approach tries to do this is by drawing on a combination of different approaches. First of all, it draws on user-centered design methods to be able to seek really detailed input from your target users at all stages of the process. So this really allows us to ensure that intervention content is acceptable and usable, but we really need to be able to go beyond just making it acceptable and usable, which is why we also draw on evidence-based behaviour change methods. So these are kind of more from behavioural science disciplines. To ensure that relevant theory and evidence is informing and underpinning our interventions. And then really importantly, it also draws on very in-depth qualitative understandings of our target users to make sure that our interventions messages are persuasive, relevant and engaging. And we try to do this in two key ways. Firstly, through ongoing PPI, so patient public involvement, and other key stakeholder co-production throughout the development process. And wherever possible, we also try to include very inductive, open-ended, qualitative or mixed methods research with a range of our target users to really try to elicit what the important and salient points are for the people you're developing your intervention for. So to date, the person-based approach has been very widely applied to the development of a range of digital interventions, and as well as interventions for kind of patients as recipients of an intervention. It's also been applied to interventions for healthcare professionals, both in primary and secondary care here in the UK. And as you can see, it's been applied to a range of different healthcare conditions and contexts. The images along the bottom of this slide are some of the logos from the various predominantly digital interventions that have been developed using the person-based approach. So this diagram summarises the various components that can contribute to the person-based approach process, and it really shows how the PPI and stakeholder co-production really sits very much at the centre of this process, and it does inform all other aspects of the process. There's also two additional core elements to the person-based approach. One is about gathering evidence about your intervention user's context and experience. So this is the yellow semicircle at the top here. And the other, so the lower green semicircle, being about developing and refining program theory. So what we mean here is about being able to understand and record how your intervention is expected to work in theory. Each of these inform the other, and they include a range of different research activities, which are shown in the little circles there. It's important to note that not all of these individual activities have to happen within one intervention development project. The person-based approach can be applied flexibly. Behind the circle here, you'll see the grey box, which depicts the key stages of the intervention development and evaluation processes. Today, I'm actually only going to focus on the planning and the optimisation phases, but the person-based approach does also have really valuable applications during implementation and evaluation of interventions as well. So that gave you a kind of overview of the whole process. So what I want to do now is break down each of those elements to go through them in a little bit more detail, and give you some examples, and also give you an opportunity to try out one element of this yourself as well. So first of all, starting with the planning stage. So why then is it important to take a person-based approach to the planning stage of interventions? The reason we feel is that it makes sure that we are starting our intervention development from a place of really understanding our users' perspectives and their needs and preferences. And importantly, understanding what some of the context-specific behavioural issues are that your intervention might need to be able to address to change behaviour. So at the outset of planning an intervention, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the fact that you can find lots and lots of different intervention features or behaviour change techniques that you could include, that could be used, but it can be difficult to decide kind of which ones to choose over others. So taking a person-based approach from this early planning stage really helps you to decide which of these might be most relevant and meaningful for your target population, and even more importantly, which ones actually are not practical or not relevant or might be disliked by the groups that you're developing your intervention for, so you know which ones to avoid. It can also be really helpful in suggesting the need for new intervention characteristics that might not yet have a kind of full evidence base behind them. So this is a kind of good example of how the person-based approach can complement more theory-based approaches. So at this point, I just like to introduce an example project that will help to illustrate this first bit of the planning phase. So the POWER study, POWER stands for Positive Online Weight Reduction, was designed to meet the need for cost-effective weight management support amongst overweight members of the general public in the UK. And it aimed to support its users to adopt a more sustainable and more positive approach to weight management. And the idea was that it enabled users to build healthy eating habits and to increase their kind of sense of autonomy and confidence in managing their kind of their weight loss journey. So this version of POWER was a web-based intervention with brief remote support from a primary care practice nurse. And it has since been developed into other formats, including a mobile app as well. POWER was shown to be effective and cost-effective for longer-term maintenance of weight loss, and the results of the fully powered trial were published in The Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. So in relation to this power example, we're going to consider what some of the first activities of the planning stage were here. And so this was all about collating and analysing existing evidence and identifying gaps where that new knowledge was needed. So in terms of how you go about this in any given project, there's no single correct way to proceed. It really does depend on the context of your intervention, the users you're developing it for, and the behaviours that you're trying to address. So you may sometimes find that there's already very extensive literature, which helps to understand these context-specific behavioural issues. So in this case, it might be that reviewing the existing literature is appropriate. So this is the activity shown here. And that might be either qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods that you review and synthesize the existing evidence. However, sometimes it might be that you're considering a very particular specific populational context, or that there isn't existing evidence to answer a specific behavioural or contextual question that you need to know the answer to. And in which case, this is when your own early primary research might be required. So again, qualitative or mixed methods tends to be able to draw out the most useful information at this point. And that's what we've identified here as user needs studies. So it's important to note here that it's not always necessary or appropriate to do both of these things at this stage. It really depends on kind of the state of the existing evidence. And as well as reviewing the existing literature and conducting qualitative research, this is also where early PPI and stakeholder input is really important too, particularly in situations where you have limited time and resources, and it may not be possible to conduct qualitative research. So in the context of the power study, what the team found was that there was actually very little in the way of existing evidence about adults' experiences of weight management. And this was really important because we needed to understand how people were experiencing their previous and existing weight management attempts to understand whether there might be specific barriers that need to be addressed. So for that reason, the team conducted a qualitative interview study with 25 adults who'd made previous weight management attempts. And one of the key findings from this work was that these individuals commonly reported lots of frequent unsuccessful weight management attempts, and also a real sense that nothing really worked for them, and they were quite despondent about going forward, that anything would work. So that's obviously just one of the key messages, but this qualitative work gave some really important insight into the context and specific behavioural needs of Power's target users. So as we move on to the next steps of the planning process, we can see how this evidence was used to inform the development of something that we call intervention guiding principles. So what are we talking about when we say guiding principles? These are a really core element of the person-based approach, and they are developed by gaining an understanding of who the users of your intervention are, what their life situation is like, and how these things relate to the behaviours that your intervention is trying to change. And this understanding, which you can obtain through your primary qualitative work, through reviewing the evidence on PPI and stakeholder input, as we've discussed, this really helps you to identify how you need to design your intervention to address these context-specific behavioural issues, to make sure that your intervention is going to be engaging and persuasive. So this is the key thing here. Guiding principles are all about engaging. How do you make your intervention engaging for the people that you want to be using it? So there are two elements of a guiding principle. First of all, a design objective, which states what it is the intervention aims to do in response to a specific need or issue that is relevant in this specific context. And then intervention key features, which state how the intervention will aim to address each of those design objectives that you've identified. So what characteristics or elements or features the intervention needs to have to be able to address those design objectives. So returning to our power example, this is just one of its guiding principles. So remembering the key finding from the qualitative work that these individuals individuals had made lots of previous unsuccessful weight management attempts, and they were really feeling like nothing had worked for them, nothing would work for them. So this is a context-specific issue that may well act as a barrier to future weight management attempts. So it was determined then that an important design objective, so that's that first part of the guiding principle for the power intervention, would be that it needed to persuade users that this approach to weight management will be effective. And then to achieve this, so then moving on to the key features of this guiding principle, it was felt that it would be important for a few things. So first of all, power to be distinctive. So for it to have something about it which made it stand out from the previous strategies that they may have tried. Also, that it should be explicitly evidence-based to give people confidence that the advice that they were being given is backed up by scientific evidence and had been shown to be effective. And also that it should be clearly non-commercial, so not affiliated with any weight loss brands and things that they might have previously tried and not worked for them, but rather developed by a team of named professionals who had affiliations to the NHS. So this is one of Power's guiding principles. So some quick kind of golden rules, if you like, for guiding principles. They really must draw on an in-depth understanding of your target user group. And as I've mentioned, this can be informed by qualitative work, by reviewing existing evidence, theory, PPI and stakeholder input, and also even the practical needs and limitations of an intervention as well. The focus of guiding principles is very much on engagement and how to make your intervention as engaging as possible. So to be engaging, it needs to be persuasive, it needs to be meaningful and enjoyable, and it should highlight how your intervention will address those key issues and challenges for your target users. And also importantly, your guiding principles should be revisited and iteratively refined throughout the development process. So as you learn more about your users and how they're starting to engage with your draft content as you develop it, you can adapt your guiding principles accordingly. So I want to give you a chance now to vote. So based on what we've just talked about, we're now going to give you a chance to vote on whether you think this is a good example of a guiding principle or if you think it needs some work. So this is an example of guiding principle that was for an intervention to promote health protective behaviours amongst young people during the pandemic. So just have a think about whether you think that's a good example or if it needs some work.
We are getting close to almost everyone participating in the poll, so I'll share the results in a second.
Okay. Fab. Great. So yeah, I think nearly all of you have said that you think it needs some work. And I agree, this one does need some work to improve it. This isn't a particularly good example. It's not specific enough. It doesn't really appear to draw on any knowledge of target users or any understanding of their needs, their preferences. And there's no real indication of how this guiding principle would make the intervention engaging for these users. So this is a slightly amended version of the previous guiding principle. So as you can see, the bold text indicates the changes that have been made since the last version. And this draws on our qualitative interviews and PPI input, which told us that motivation to wear a mask amongst young people was actually quite low. So we could then be more specific in our design objectives. So rather than just saying encourage or support, we know that what we actually need to do is to target their motivation for the behaviour. And then having decided we need to target motivation, we could then be more specific about how we might achieve this. So helping people to understand the benefits of a behaviour might increase their motivation to do it. So I'm going to ask you to vote again now. What do you think about this revised version? Do you think this is now a good example? Or do you think it still needs work? Great. So a bit more split on that one. A few of you think that it's now a good example. Some of you think it still needs some work. It's certainly an improved version. So you can see where we've started to draw on knowledge of the target users to inform the guiding principles there. But I would argue that there's actually even more that could still be done. And this comes from really getting to grips with understanding your target users. So the qualitative and PPI work that we did also told us that young people are aware of the benefits of wearing face masks, but they're just not especially concerned for themselves. But they do have more concerns about protecting other people. So we know that promoting the benefits of mask wearing for protecting themselves actually may not be that persuasive for young people, but by focusing on the benefits for other people, that's likely to be far more persuasive amongst this group. So at this point, we now, having made these kind of further tweaks to it, we now have a relatively good example of a guiding principle. So hopefully that just demonstrates how really understanding your target user group is vital for developing good guiding principles. I'm going to move on now from guiding principles to another element of the planning process, which is something called an intervention planning table that we use. And this can include behavioural analysis and also a little bit about developing a logic model. So behavioural analysis and logic models they're not things that are unique to the person-based approach. So you will hear about those in other aspects of other approaches to developing interventions. But the intervention planning table and combining these activities with the in-depth user-based work and also developing guiding principles is specific to the person-based approach. So first of all, the intervention planning table, what is it? So it's a tool that helps us to systematically collate evidence about important barriers and facilitators of the behaviours that we want our intervention to change, and to then start identifying and recording possible intervention content and features that might address these. The optional behavioural analysis aspect of this is also a really useful way of mapping to potentially relevant theory. And the intervention planning table can also be a really useful tool for us in the co-production activities with other stakeholders, because it forms a really important record of the rationale and the evidence base for all the intervention content we're proposing. So in terms of how we use it, first of all, we have a template that's available to download from the PBA website, which I will link you to at the end. So we draw on the evidence that we've gathered. So this might be from the qualitative interviews we've done, the literature reviewing, consultation with PPI and stakeholders, and we tabulate the relevant behaviours and the identified barriers and facilitators to those behaviours. And we also record the source of evidence for each of these, so where we found out about that. Next, we start to identify and document possible intervention contents, functions, features that are likely to be able to address these things. And this might be based on the knowledge and experience of our team members. It might be from published evidence, from PPI input. And then the last part of this that we often do is the behavioural analysis element. And here we map the identified behavioural determinants and the proposed intervention features onto relevant theory or theoretical frameworks. And this really serves two main functions. First of all, it helps us to describe the proposed intervention components in quite standardised terminology that's widely recognised within the intervention development field. And importantly, it can also offer an opportunity to identify from the theory whether there's possibly important theoretical constructs to target or intervention functions that we could use that we might not have identified in our initial planning work. So thinking a little bit more about the behavioural analysis element, it's important to note that there isn't really any one correct theory to use. It very much depends on your intervention and what's especially relevant for the behaviours under consideration. There might be specific psychological or other theories that are especially relevant to behaviours you're aiming to address. We often draw on something like the theoretical domains framework as a broad theoretical framework of behaviour change that incorporates theoretical constructs from a wide range of other theories. And this is quite helpful because it also maps well onto the behaviour change wheel, which can then help to identify sources of behaviour that should be targeted to initiate behaviour change and the corresponding intervention functions that might be successful in achieving those changes. And then from here, the behaviour change wheel can also be helpful for identifying at a more granular level what specific behaviour change techniques, for example, might be able to achieve these intervention functions. This is an example of an excerpt from an intervention planning table for an intervention called BP Together. This is an intervention that has been designed to help people monitor their own blood pressure at home after a stroke. It's a digital intervention, so there's an app or a website where people can enter their blood pressure readings and get immediate feedback. And their GP will receive a prompt to change their patient's medication if their blood pressure readings are raised. I don't have time to go through the whole table, but I will be sharing my slides afterwards so that you can look through that example. So the final step to the planning phase to discuss is the logic model. I'm not really going to speak much about this as I've mentioned, it's not specific to the person-based approach, but just briefly, during the intervention planning phase, we tend to also create a logic model which draws on all of the preceding guiding principles, the behavioural analysis, the intervention planning table, so that we can hypothesize how our intervention is expected to work. So it's a diagrammatic representation of our intervention, starting from what the problem is, leading right through the planned features and functions of the intervention, leading up to kind of what the expected mechanisms of change are, right through to what the anticipated or desired outcome of the intervention will be. And we tend to draw on the MRC process evaluation guidance, which gives advice about the creation of logic models. So it results in a testable model that can inform the design of the subsequent process evaluation of your intervention. So that was an absolute whistle-stop tour of the planning process. Next, I'm going to move on to thinking about how we start to optimise our intervention content once we've planned and started to develop it. That's not to say that the planning phase necessarily stops at this stage. So we continue to update and adjust our planning and content development as we learn more about our target users through optimisation. So returning to our diagram, the elements we're mainly going to focus on here are what we call real-time user studies, where we get people to engage with the content whilst we find out about their views and experiences, and our table of changes tool, which documents and facilitates the decision-making process about how we adapt this content in response to feedback. So first of all, thinking about how we collect the data that helps us to start seeking feedback and optimizing our content. We rely a lot on inductive qualitative research to help us gain insights into whether the intervention components we've developed are easy to engage with and to understand, whether they are feasible to deliver for people to access, and if they deliver messages that appear to be reasonable and acceptable to our target users. And beyond that, we also want to make sure that our intervention materials are being perceived as motivating, enjoyable, persuasive, informative, and hopefully novel in some elements as well. So there are several specific methods that we tend to use quite regularly. Think aloud studies, which I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly. And these really help us to elicit target users' reactions to kind of every element of the intervention content. We also tend to combine these with retrospective or longitudinal qualitative interviews to explore users' experiences of the intervention in more kind of real world type settings. And then finally, triangulation with quantitative data and with digital interventions is often usage data that you can collect about how many times people access certain pages, whether there are certain sections they're using, how long they spend on these pages. So thinking specifically about Think Aloud interviews, in this style of interview, we ask users to engage with the intervention material, and whilst doing so, we ask them to say out loud any thoughts that come to mind. This obviously lends itself especially well to digital intervention materials. And we find that Think Alouds are especially good for getting people's immediate unfiltered reactions to intervention content, especially adverse reactions, which obviously it's really important for us to know about early on. Also allows you to observe how your users engage with your intervention and whether they do that in the way that you would expect them to, or if kind of they use it in a different way than you would expect. It's a really useful way of identifying any problems. So technical issues, bugs, glitches, typos, any aspects of it that don't work as you expect them to. And it's also really good for allowing this process of iterative development. So it makes it possible to test some initial content with your first batch of Think Aloud interviews, to be able to then collate some of that feedback, implement some changes on the basis of this, and then test the revised content in the next batch of Think Alouds. So I just want to pause there for a second. I will stop sharing my screen for a minute, just to ask about whether any of you have experience of already having used Think Aloud interviews, and any benefits and challenges that you've kind of experienced, or even amongst people who haven't used them, any benefits and challenges that you kind of think immediately come to mind about this type of approach. Anyone got any thoughts there? Ben?
I mean, I thought I'd start off while other people think of them. I mean, I guess, Rosie, one of the big issues that I often find is if you like the amount of time it takes to do something well. And especially when you're working in a kind of tech environment with industry partners outside of academia, when we're focused on kind of academic rigor, and your partners, need to be profitable and need to be making something good and quickly and doing these updates quickly. And I don't know whether you have similar experiences in that field.
Yeah, I would agree that the kind of timelines and things are a challenging element of it. I don't know as I have any particular answers to that. I think we often find that you have to kind of set boundaries and deadlines and to decide at which point kind of you're going to stop with various iterative rounds of Think Alouds and things, because like you say, sometimes there are just working with industry partners and things, you do just have to set deadlines and decide that at a certain point that you're going to stop.
Yeah, I think we kind of did sprints, didn't we? So rather than having constant iterations, maybe discussions in advance with the kind of DevOps teams on, right, we're going to do sprints and then iterate, and then sprints and then iterate, or have it in-house, which we've done a lot, haven't we? Where you kind of just constantly iterate, which is brilliant, but not always practical. Yeah.
Rachel, I think you were next.
Hi, Rosie. I just wanted to say that we've done some Think Aloud interviews with people living with skin conditions to test items for a new measure of life impact. And I think obviously this kind of study and this sort of task that you ask people to do, we know as researchers that it's very taxing, but what we were quite surprised at is that how quickly people started to show signs of sort of fatigue and tiredness, and they were sort of getting confused between concepts. So I just think it's more of a comment rather than a question, but just to say that that's something that we struggled with our study. I don't know if that's something that you can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I think you find that with Think Aloud type interviews, it is quite an unnatural thing to ask people to do as a participant. And you do, I think a really good thing to do, and one of the things I'll come to in a minute, is encourage trying to be a participant yourself so that you know what it feels like. Because it is quite a strange thing to have to do, to keep reminding people to talk out loud. So I would completely agree that people do fatigue more quickly than they perhaps would in a different types of qualitative interview. I'm going to move on for the sake of time. Ian, do you have a quick point? You're on mute, Ian. Oh. Can't hear you, Ian, still.
I think that must be on Ian's end, because he's on the, so I don't know anything else we can do. Maybe if you can see your question.
Hear me now?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, so the question is, how do you deal with Think Aloud being a kind of very rational process when perhaps components of your intervention might rely on more automatic processes? We used Think Aloud to develop the decision aid in the decision trial led by Teresa Marteau, and it felt like we missed the kind of glanceability kind of processes that people used when they're actually using it in real life. And so perhaps we missed something there. So how do you deal with that kind of automatic side of things?
We tend to try and combine where we can. We try and combine Think Aloud interviews with kind of more longitudinal or retrospective type qualitative interviews as well, where we try and encourage people. We kind of give people intervention content to go away and use in real life, if you like, so as they would, without the kind of strange situation of us sitting there asking them to talk about it out loud. So we try and then seek to interview them after they've had some experience of using it in their own time, to see then whether they're kind of they have any different experiences, because we do acknowledge that obviously it's a bit of a strange artificial situation to sit there with us and talking through it, and we do those combination of things do tend to help. Ben, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not just the sort of those emotional things, is it? It's quite a lot of our behaviour change interventions, goal setting, habit formation, rely on longitudinal processes, like seeing what happens after a week, evaluating your goals, and the longitudinal, real world piloting is also really useful for that. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry if anyone else has further questions. I am going to have to move on for now, but thank you for your input there. That's really, really helpful. So just a few tips from our team's kind of collective experiences of conducting Think Aloud interviews. As I mentioned there, practice being a participant yourself. It really does help you to understand what it is you're asking your participants to do and what it feels like. We also suggest, again, as I've just mentioned that conversation, it's important to consider combining your Think Alouds with other forms of qualitative interview or kind of quantitative survey data even, because it can help to increase your understanding of the context in which participants are engaging with your intervention. And then there's a few tips here about actually conducting the interview itself. I won't go through all of these, but just pick out a couple. Try to use kind of quite neutral prompts. So things like, what are you thinking now? What are your first impressions here? So things that aren't necessarily overly directive, but just trying to keep that conversation flowing and remind people that you are asking them to share all of their thoughts. Asking people to think about the content rather than necessarily the appearance of the page itself, because this tends to invite comments about colours, look, presentation. And it's obviously not that these things aren't important, but it's often quite hard to get consensus on those types of issues. So we tend to use prompts like, what do you think about the message presented here? How much do you agree with X, Y, and Z? Because that really gets at the kind of crux of the messages and the content that's being delivered. Just this kind of idea of explicitly reiterating to participants that you're really keen for them to express negative views as well. Some people are happy to do that, but some people are quite reluctant as they know you're obviously involved in the research yourself. So just a few tips there. Moving on from thinking about how we collect the data to deciding what to do with it once you've got it. As you might expect, you're often faced with a wealth of qualitative data, and sometimes it's very easy to determine what action points to take in terms of amending the intervention. So where lots of people have made similar comments about a particular feature, but it's not always so immediately clear. So sometimes people are quite ambivalent about things, or there might be conflicting opinions. So thinking about how we decide which feedback needs to be implemented and perhaps which is less important or might reflect differences in personal preference. One of the key tools we use here is something called a table of changes shown on this slide. And we use this to collate feedback on the draft intervention materials. So the top row of each section in the grey bar indicates which section or page or feature of the intervention that we're considering. The two leftmost columns are where we record comments, positive and negative, from participants. So we try to align the positive and negative comments which relate to the same issues, because this helps us to decide whether a feature is kind of unanimously positively or negatively received, or whether the views are a bit more divided.
The next column is where we record a possible solution or a means of addressing the issue that we've identified, which we can then take to team discussions to see if there's other ideas. And then the following column is where we record our reasons for why we think it's important to make this change or not. And we use a coding framework to help us document these reasons, which I'll talk about a bit more on the next slide. And then the final two columns are we record the change that we agreed to make after discussion, and then the priority that we assign to addressing this change using the Moscow framework. So this is changes that we must make, changes that we should make, changes that we could make, and changes that we would like to address if we have sufficient time and resources. So depending on the time and resources available, we tend to focus primarily on the must and should priorities. And as well as recording feedback from participants in the table of changes, we also record feedback from PPI and other stakeholders, because this allows us to record feedback from a range of sources which are important for the decision-making process. So this is the coding framework that I mentioned that we use to help us decide whether or not a change is important. I'm not going to go through all of these because they're described in the slide, but just to pick out one example. So the EXP code there, so that stands for experience. And we would use this where there's issues arising that we know are supported by either the opinions of experts within our team that agree that this change would be important and the reasons for that, or existing literature, or the theory and evidence suggests that such a change would be effective, and again, the reasons why. And this is where it's really important to record the feedback from our PPI and stakeholders too, because it helps to resonate with this code. So you'll often find that multiple of these codes might apply to one issue, so it's fine to use multiple codes. So we want to give you a chance to have a go at using this table of changes to make some decisions about changes to an intervention based on some sample feedback that we're going to give you. So we're going to share the document in the chat now. So the feedback that you'll see is closely based on some that we received on early versions of an intervention called Active Brains. And this is a digital behaviour change intervention which aims to protect older adults' cognitive health through encouraging them to engage in physical activity, to engage in brain training type activities, and to move towards healthier eating patterns. So what the document that we'll share in the chat, we've given you a table of changes that has been, it's been populated with some positive and negative comments, and we're going to put you into some breakout groups. And what we'd like you to discuss with the members of your breakout group is basically like you to fill in the rest of the table. So discuss the possible change that could be implemented in light of these comments, the reasons for the change using the coding framework, and what you think might be a priority level. I think we'll only be able to have about 10 minutes on this, but we will put you into breakout groups now. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, I'm working on that now. So everyone should see the document in the general chat, and I will create 4 breakout rooms as we have about 20 participants as of now.
Lovely, thank you. So we will, Ben and I are going to try and pop in and to the breakout groups as you're going. So if you've got questions and things, we can try and help with those.
Okay, so I'll open the rooms and then you will see a prompt to join the room.
Thank you.
Okay, seems to be working as people are leaving the main room.
Do we want to give people a chance to discuss amongst themselves for a bit?
Yeah, normally give them a couple of minutes just to have a chance to read things and introduce.
No one likes the teacher getting all involved.
Oh. Me too.
Okay, I feel like one room is very empty. Room number 2, so I might.
Yeah, there's 5 people in room 1, aren't there?
Yeah, well, someone hasn't joined, but I'll this person is not going to be very happy. But
Can move them to another room, maybe.
Yeah.
Probably means they're doing something else.
So Ben, when we join the rooms, do you want to do 1 and 2 and I'll do 3 and 4?
Yeah, that is good. Actually, Rosie, can we swap? Can I do 3 and 4 just because one of them is an old master student of mine in room 4 and it'd be nice to talk to him.
Yeah, no problem.
You will notice on your phone, Rosie, about 1,000 WhatsApp messages from me. Because we had
and a message from Sarah Kirby as well telling me.
It's still probably this room is the one that's being recorded.
Okay. No, I had to move location because we had a Wi-Fi down.
Oh no. Okay. Right. Shall we join these groups?
Yeah, I'll go to room 4 or room 3, then room 4.
Just a quick note for people who might be watching the recording. We are now working in breakout rooms, so the activity is happening in those rooms, which cannot all be shared at the same time, but we will come back in a few minutes to wrap up the workshop. So maybe switch to that part of the recording.
Hi.
So I have set a note for the recording that the activity was happening in the breakout rooms, and that we will come back together.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, I think if we have another couple of minutes, because I'm very aware that I'm running out of time. I do only have a few more slides. I think if we, because it gives them a minute's notice, doesn't it, to end the breakout group. So I think maybe if we...
I can end them directly. So so I can close them immediately. That's the case. Should I do that now, or should we?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, it says exactly as you said, 60 seconds.
Lovely.
Welcome back.
Oh, I think I need to go back to my room.
No, we are actually ending the rooms in 30 seconds, so as you wish.
Okay.
Everyone will be back in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
I will reshare my screen. Is that everyone back?
Yes, we should all be back.
Brilliant. Okay. So hopefully that just gave a little sense of kind of what you can do with the table of changes and how it can record your decision-making process. I'm aware it wasn't very long, so sorry we didn't have more time on that. But just to kind of summarize the purpose and the function of this table of changes, the idea is that it's a systematic way of recording comments and possible solutions and the rationale for these to make sure that our decision-making process is transparent and can be referred back to. It also aims to make the decision-making process efficient. So rather than needing to conduct, for example, a complete thematic analysis, which we do separately later on, that would obviously be very time-consuming and look far more in depth at the data. But this allows us to pick out key issues to be addressed and to action these quickly to be able to have a next version of the intervention ready to continue testing. And the table also acts as a prompt for discussion amongst the research team. So once you've recorded the key points, it makes it much easier to then have discussion about the changes that might be required compared to everyone having to trawl back through lots of interview transcripts. So that brings us to the end of our very whistle-stop tour of the planning and optimization phases of the person-based approach. Hopefully you can see that we've touched on the majority of the activities identified in this diagram and have started to get a sense of how these contribute to the overall process. So just some final thoughts. It's intended to be a flexible approach that can be tailored to the needs and the aims and, being pragmatic, the available resources of your work as well. And we're, of course, not saying that it's the only good way to develop digital behaviour change interventions, but we feel its strengths lie in the fact that it can be applied alongside more theoretical aspects of intervention planning. And importantly, it provides an explicit process for identifying behavioural issues to be addressed from the perspective of the target user. And it works very closely with those users to identify the best ways of addressing them. So there's some more information here from on the PBA website, and I will share my slides afterwards. And if we have any time left for questions, I'm happy to answer any.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for a wonderful workshop and fitting into such a tight time frame. I know that Lucy has a question that she has posted in the chat, but she has also raised her hand. So Lucy, I guess you can go ahead and say your question.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering about how you conceptualize co-production in a person-based approach. So I know that it's a real challenge in the literature that we have lots of people kind of thinking about different underlying principles and lots of people implementing it differently. And I would say probably kind of talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. So I guess, yeah, particularly how in this area you implement it so that this is co-production, not kind of a more traditional sort of participation. Yeah, so that would be it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We tend to try and involve our patient public involvement representatives and other stakeholders in a few different ways. So quite often we will have part of our management groups for our projects. And we have PPI members who are actually part of those groups. So they are, throughout the development process, all development meetings and things they're invited to, and they're very much invited to be involved in all of those decision-making processes. And as we're developing the content, they're very closely involved in that. We also sometimes do kind of then more kind of community-based PPI work, where if we want to kind of get some wider, more diverse input, but still from people who are kind of potentially target users of our intervention, we might then go out to a kind of broader group of people who are not so directly closely involved in the research. And then obviously we try to have the qualitative participant element as well, where that's possible, but we appreciate that that's kind of dependent on time and resources. So we try and kind of have a bit of a mixture of people who are very, very closely involved and part of the research team effectively, and then more diverse groups that we consult as well. Ben?
Yeah, can I add something to that? I think it's really and they obviously the Venn diagrams overlap hugely, but I do think sometimes when you do when you are really intensively co-participatory developing an intervention with the end users, you do end up with experienced, non-naive end users. And actually, I think it's really important to recognize that what the person-based approach does is it gets a lot of very sort of unacademic input from the people who are actually going to be using it. And actually, it's quite different sometimes from the feedback or the co-participatory input that you get from people who are accustomed to working with academic teams. And there are obviously many different ways to slice a potato, but I do think it's constantly worth reflecting on the different feedback that you're getting from these different processes. And if you're lacking one of them, how you can bring it in another area, if that makes sense. And I think it is one string. I think Ingrid Muller's done a fantastic paper actually with Rosie, possibly you co-authored that one, on the overlap between the two and how to bring them together. And I'm sure we can share that.
Thank you.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, if there is one. Rosie has also said that if you have additional questions, she would be happy to reply to those. Okay, in that case, I might actually have one high-level question to wrap up with. It's fascinating, and I feel like I could be doing the planning and optimization phase forever, for a lifetime. Is there a time frame or the minimum? Let's say I have only 3 months before I need to implement or test my intervention. Is it even worth going into it? What's the least amount? What would you say is the ideal time frame?
Obviously, the more time, the better, if you can have it. But I appreciate that that's, for the most part, not realistic for most people. And the idea is that it can be applied flexibly. And and you can make it work for the timeframes you want to work with. So during the pandemic, I know Ben was heavily involved with the rapid optimization of the germ defense intervention. And that was, I mean, there were about 5 or 6 iterations of that within, was it 3 months, Ben?
Am I muted? No. Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. Obviously, everything in COVID seemed incredibly rapid, didn't it? But yeah, I mean, the thing about the person-based approach is actually, if you remember that diagram, which has all the little dots, you know, to do all of them thoroughly would take a year for each one. So you're always doing the best you can do with the resources and tool that you're, and often it comes down to what is your research funding status as well. If you're in a huge program grant, you could have a research fellow on each one. Sometimes it's just you trying to do your best. And that's when actually incorporating existing experience is really, really useful, looking at existing interventions, seeing if there's primary data from other very similar things that you can bring in, and you know, even speaking to the researchers who developed those and trying to get learning from there. Like there's, again, lots of ways to skin a potato. And I think the person-based approach is a nice manual for allowing you to be practical and pragmatic with all these different data sources.
Yeah, completely agree.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that brings us to the very end of our workshop, because I want to be mindful of everyone's time. The resources, as Rosie mentioned, the slides will be posted online. We will also provide additional resources linked to the website, all that. So you will find that on the event at the Open Digital Health website. So thank you very much again, Rosie and Ben, to leading this workshop. And I will hope to see most of you at some other Open Digital Health events. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.